Sarah stood in front of her bedroom mirror, admiring the way the new designer dress hugged her figure perfectly. She smiled, feeling a sense of satisfaction that came from knowing she'd stand out at tonight's event. It wasn't just the dress. Her shoes, handbag, and even the earrings sparkled with the same level of extravagance. On the outside, Sarah was the picture of success, a woman who had it all together. But beneath the surface, a storm of financial stress brewed, threatening to unravel the life she had built. Her closet overflowed with similar purchases, each item a symbol of her success, or at least the image of success she was trying to maintain. But lately, the satisfaction of a new luxury item had been short-lived, replaced quickly by a familiar knot in her stomach whenever she saw the credit card bills pile up. Sarah knew deep down that she couldn't keep this up forever, but each swipe of her card felt like a small escape from reality. "I'll pay it off next month," she muttered to herself as she grabbed her purse and headed out the door. It was the same thing she had told herself for years, pushing the problem to the back of her mind. But with each passing month, the debt grew larger, and the payments became harder to make. Sarah's friends envied her lifestyle. She was the one who always had the latest fashion, the one who could afford lavish vacations on a whim. What they didn't know was that her entire lifestyle was funded by credit cards, and those vacations were far from spontaneous. They were meticulously planned around her ability to make the minimum payments on her debt. She often found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she had gotten here. The financial independence she once had felt like a distant memory. The credit card statements now came with staggering balances, and she had begun to avoid opening them altogether, opting instead to throw them into a drawer, hoping they'd disappear on their own. But they didn't. They never did. Sarah's inner dialogue was a constant battle. On one hand, she felt she deserved the luxury she indulged in. After all, she worked hard, didn't she? She had earned the right to treat herself, to live a life that reflected her success. But on the other hand, there was the gnawing voice of reality. What if I lose my job? How will I cover all these bills? What happens when the credit runs out? The thoughts came rushing in at unexpected times, leaving her uneasy in moments that should have been full of joy. The dinner parties, the shopping sprees, the weekend getaways, they all came with a price that was starting to feel heavier than any luxury item could offset. As Sarah slipped into the back of a cab, heading to yet another upscale event, she glanced at her phone to check her bank account. The numbers stared back at her, empty. Her savings account had been drained long ago to cover a few payments, and her checking account wasn't much better. She quickly switched over to her credit card app, hesitating before tapping it open. She bit her lip as the balance appeared on the screen. Another month, another increase. "I can handle this. I've handled worse," she told herself, trying to ignore the growing unease in her chest. But deep down, Sarah knew the truth. She was in over her head, and no amount of swiping or pretending could fix it. The irony of it all struck her as she walked into the dimly lit venue, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Here she was, a woman dressed to perfection, mingling with people who praised her for her impeccable taste, her apparent success. Yet, no one knew that behind that polished exterior, her financial life was crumbling. She smiled and waved as she entered the room, but her mind was elsewhere. How long could she keep this charade up? At what point would it all come crashing down? With every passing event, every swipe of the card, Sarah was digging herself deeper into a hole she feared she might never climb out of. The life she had built on credit was starting to feel less like a dream and more like a prison. The weight of it all pressed down on her, and for the first time, she wondered if it was time to stop running from the truth. The cracks in her perfect life were growing wider, and soon they would be impossible to hide. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her, staring blankly at the screen. The notification from her credit card app had just popped up. Your credit limit has been reached. No further transactions can be processed. She blinked a few times, as if the message might change if she just waited long enough. But it didn't. She was maxed out on all of her cards. A wave of panic washed over her as she clicked to view her accounts in detail. The numbers were staggering, balances in the tens of thousands, all with interest piling on top each month. She had been making the minimum payments for so long that the original amounts seemed like a distant memory. Now, even that small amount was more than she could afford. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed her bank's customer service line. The hold music played for what felt like an eternity before a voice finally came through. "Hi, this is Daniel. How can I assist you today?" Sarah cleared her throat, trying to keep her voice steady. "Hi, I'm calling because I think I'm in trouble. I just got a notification that I've hit my credit limit and I'm not sure what to do. Is there any way I can increase my limit or maybe get a temporary extension?" Daniel paused, and Sarah could hear him typing on the other end. "Let me take a look at your account, Sarah," he said, his tone professional yet polite. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes, and Sarah's heart raced as she waited for him to deliver the verdict. "Okay, I'm seeing here that you've reached the credit limit on all of your cards with us, and unfortunately, we can't extend the limit any further at this time. You've also missed a payment last month, so there's a late fee applied to your balance. Is there anything else I can assist you with?" Sarah felt like the wind had been knocked out of her. "Missed a payment?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. How had she not noticed? When had things gotten this bad? Her mind raced, flashing back to the weeks and months of swiping her card without a second thought, assuring herself it would all get sorted later. But later had come, and now there was no more room to run. "Sarah?" Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts. "Is there anything else I can do for you?" She shook her head, though he couldn't see it. "No, thank you. I'll figure it out." She hung up the phone, her heart pounding in her chest. The room suddenly felt too small, too quiet. Her eyes wandered to the pile of unopened bills on the counter, each one marked with bright red letters that screamed, "Past due." She had been ignoring them for weeks, hoping that somehow the problem would solve itself. But the truth was, it had only gotten worse, and now it was unavoidable. She reached for the nearest envelope, tearing it open with shaky hands. The amount owed was more than she made in a month, and she had no idea how she would cover it. The reality of her situation finally hit her like a ton of bricks. She was drowning in debt, and there was no quick fix. The weight of her spending decisions over the years pressed down on her, suffocating her. Sarah had always told herself she could handle it, that she was just one paycheck away from catching up. But now, staring at the insurmountable numbers, she realized she had been lying to herself all along. Her phone buzzed with another notification, this time from her landlord. The rent was due in 2 days, and she didn't have enough in her account to cover it. Panic welled up inside her. "What am I going to do?" she thought, the room spinning as her mind raced through potential solutions, none of which felt remotely realistic. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to consider the unthinkable. She might lose everything if she didn't get her financial situation under control. The lavish lifestyle, the luxury goods, the carefree spending. It had all led her here, to this moment of reckoning. She was out of options, and it was time to face the consequences head-on. She sat there for a long time, staring at the pile of bills, knowing that the path forward wouldn't be easy, but it was a path she could no longer avoid. The days following her realization passed in a blur. Sarah felt like she was walking through thick fog, her mind heavy with worry. She avoided her phone as much as possible, terrified of another notification or call from her creditors. Each unopened bill on the counter was a silent reminder of how deep she was in trouble, but the idea of confronting it head-on was paralyzing. It was easier to pretend it wasn't there, even though she knew that was no longer an option. Her once busy social calendar had become a list of excuses. Invitations to brunches, dinners, and shopping trips piled up, but she couldn't bring herself to go. "I'm not feeling well today," had become her go-to response, though in truth it wasn't a lie. Sarah was exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained by the constant weight of her debt. She had started distancing herself from her friends, embarrassed that they might somehow find out about her financial struggles. How could she admit that she, the one who always seemed to have everything, was barely keeping her head above water? Her credit cards, once her safety net, now felt like chains around her neck, pulling her deeper into despair. Every time she reached for her wallet, she hesitated. Even small purchases, like a coffee or a taxi ride, brought on a wave of guilt and panic. She would replay her financial decisions over and over in her head, wondering how she had let things get so out of control. Late at night, when the world was quiet and there was no one to distract her, Sarah lay in bed, consumed by her thoughts. She stared at the ceiling, replaying her shopping sprees in her mind. The designer bags, the expensive jewelry, the endless meals at five-star restaurants. None of it had filled the void she was trying to escape from. In fact, they had only made it worse. What was I thinking? She asked herself, though she already knew the answer. Every swipe of her card had been an attempt to mask a deeper, more personal emptiness. She'd spent years trying to fill that void with things that glittered and sparkled, things that made her feel special, even if only for a moment. But the high had never lasted long, and now she was left with nothing but guilt and shame. The isolation was the worst part. Sarah had always been social, the life of every party, but now she found herself withdrawing from everyone around her. She couldn't bear to face her friends, knowing they wouldn't understand. How could they? They still saw her as the woman who had it all together, the one who always looked perfect and could afford to live without limits. She had even begun avoiding her family. Phone calls from her mother went unanswered, and when her sister texted, Sarah could barely bring herself to respond. She felt like a fraud, like she was living a double life, one that looked flawless on the outside but was falling apart from the inside out. The weight of it all was unbearable. The debt wasn't just a financial burden, it had become an emotional one too. Every morning she woke up with a pit in her stomach, the same dread-filled anxiety greeting her before her feet even hit the floor. She couldn't escape it. It followed her everywhere, from the grocery store to her own living room. Sarah found herself crying more than she ever had before. Little things, a commercial about vacations, a friend posting pictures of a shopping spree, would set her off. The things she once took pride in were now the very things that triggered her deepest sense of failure. "Why did I do this to myself?" she whispered one night, her hands clutching the blanket as she curled up on the couch. The realization was slow but undeniable. Her spending had been about more than just enjoying the finer things in life. It had been a way to avoid facing the parts of herself she didn't want to acknowledge, the loneliness, the insecurity, the fear of not being enough. And now, with the debt piled up around her, she had no choice but to confront those feelings head-on. The emotional toll was immense, and yet, for the first time, Sarah understood that this reckoning was inevitable. She couldn't run from it any longer. It was time to face not just the financial mess she had created, but the emotional one as well. Sarah sat in her living room, the weight of her financial burdens still pressing heavily on her shoulders, but now, a sense of restlessness had started to replace the numbness she had felt for weeks. She had spent enough time wallowing in her guilt and fear. Now she needed a solution, something to give her a way out of the mess she had created. Scrolling through her phone late one evening, a podcast title caught her eye. "Taking Control of Your Money: The Power of Financial Boundaries." The words control and boundaries seemed to leap out at her, so she hit play, half expecting it to be yet another lecture on cutting back or saving more, things she'd heard 1,000 times but never really absorbed. But as the host began to speak, Sarah found herself drawn in. The woman's voice was calm, reassuring, not judgmental or patronizing. She spoke about the importance of setting financial boundaries, not as a punishment, but as a form of self-care. For the first time, Sarah heard budgeting described in a way that didn't sound like deprivation. It wasn't about saying no to everything she loved. It was about creating space for the things that really mattered and learning how to prioritize them. The idea hit Sarah like a breath of fresh air. "Financial boundaries," she whispered, testing the phrase out on her lips. It sounded empowering, almost liberating, as if by simply defining her limits, she could regain some semblance of control. It wasn't about sacrificing the life she enjoyed. It was about making sure she could sustain it without living in fear of the next bill or credit card statement. She grabbed a notepad from the coffee table, her mind already spinning with questions. What are my boundaries? How much am I willing to spend on luxuries? What are my non-negotiables? For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could turn this around. The next day, she dove deeper, researching everything she could about budgeting and financial boundaries. She read stories of people who had clawed their way out of debt by learning to control their spending, not through harsh restrictions, but by setting clear, manageable limits. She came across articles that spoke to her about the psychological impact of overspending, the emotional triggers that led people to use shopping as an escape. It all resonated so deeply with her own experience. One article stood out. "A budget isn't a prison, it's a map. It shows you where you can go and where you should be cautious." Sarah smiled as she read those words, feeling something inside her shift. This wasn't about cutting off her joy. It was about directing her energy toward a future she could actually sustain. For years, she had seen budgeting as a kind of punishment, a sign that she had failed. But now she saw it differently. Setting boundaries didn't mean she had to stop enjoying life. It meant she could start enjoying it without the constant anxiety that had been gnawing at her for so long. She began to make a plan. First, she listed her non-negotiables, the things that truly brought her joy and were worth keeping in her life, like the occasional dinner with friends or the simple pleasure of a good book. Next, she identified the areas where she had been reckless, impulsive purchases, overpriced coffee, last-minute trips that she could no longer justify. Her first attempts at setting limits felt awkward, like trying to learn a new language, but each time she resisted the urge to splurge on something unnecessary, she felt a small victory. It wasn't easy, but it felt possible. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months: hope. Sarah's mindset began to shift. She no longer felt like she was at the mercy of her bills and bank accounts. Slowly, she started to realize that she could shape her financial future, one decision at a time. The power wasn't in how much money she made or how expensive her lifestyle had been. It was in learning how to set limits that worked for her. She still had a long road ahead, but this was her turning point. Sarah wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to take control. And that realization, more than any luxury purchase she'd ever made, brought her a sense of empowerment she hadn't felt in years. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by papers and her laptop, where she'd spent the last 2 hours working on her new budget. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't easy. But for the first time, she felt a sense of control over her finances. Gone were the days of blind spending and hoping everything would balance out in the end. Now she was in charge, and she had a plan. The first few weeks were the hardest. Each time she opened her closet and saw the untouched designer bags and clothes, she felt a pang of regret, not for buying them, but for the way they symbolized her old habits. She used to get a rush from shopping, the thrill of a new purchase, the dopamine hit of swiping her card. Now that rush was gone, replaced by a quiet determination to stick to her budget. One evening, as she scrolled through her phone, she saw a message from her friend Lisa. "Girls' weekend coming up. Let's hit the shops and grab dinner downtown." Sarah bit her lip. She'd usually jump at the chance for a weekend like this, but now things were different. She couldn't afford to mindlessly swipe her card at every boutique and high-end restaurant like she used to. Instead of making excuses, she texted back, "I'm trying to be smarter with my money, so I'm going to pass on the shopping part, but I'll join you for dinner." Her finger hovered over the send button for a moment. Would her friends understand? She didn't want to feel left out, but she also didn't want to slip back into her old habits. With a deep breath, she pressed send, feeling a mix of anxiety and relief. Moments later, Lisa replied, "Totally get it. We've all been there. Dinner sounds great." Sarah exhaled, smiling to herself. One small victory. She had set a boundary and stuck to it, and it felt good. But it wasn't always that simple. There were days when the temptation was almost too much to resist, like the time she walked past her favorite boutique on her way to work. The dress in the window practically called her name, and for a split second she considered walking in and buying it. Just one purchase. "I deserve it," she thought, her fingers inching toward her wallet. But then she remembered the podcast, the articles, and the promise she had made to herself. Financial boundaries. She took a deep breath and kept walking, proud of herself for sticking to her plan, even though it felt like a small sacrifice. At home, her budgeting system was in full swing. She had created categories for her spending, necessities like rent, utilities, and groceries, and then a separate column for wants. The wants category was much smaller than it used to be, but Sarah didn't mind. She found that the less she spent on unnecessary luxuries, the more freedom she felt. There was something empowering about seeing her savings account grow, little by little. She celebrated small milestones, like the moment she paid off her first credit card. It wasn't a huge balance, but closing that account felt like lifting a weight off her shoulders. Her inner dialogue started to shift, where once she felt trapped by her finances, now she began to see the rewards of her discipline. Each payment she made, each item she didn't buy, was a step closer to freedom. Conversations with her friends began to change as well. When they made plans to go out, Sarah didn't feel the same pressure to spend lavishly to keep up appearances. At dinner, she chose meals within her budget and declined expensive cocktails without guilt. It was a small change, but an important one, and each time she did it, she felt more in control of her choices. One evening, Sarah met up with her friend Rachel, who was always quick to spend on the newest trends. Over drinks, Rachel casually mentioned a new designer handbag she had her eye on. "You should get one too, Sarah. We'll match," Rachel said, flashing her credit card with a grin. For a moment, the old Sarah might have been tempted, but instead she smiled and shook her head. "I'm trying something new," Sarah said. "I'm focusing on saving for things that really matter, so I'll pass for now." Rachel raised an eyebrow, surprised, but didn't push the issue. As the weeks went on, Sarah noticed how her new habits were slowly becoming second nature. When she received her paycheck, she no longer felt the urge to spend it on something extravagant right away. Instead, she took pride in allocating it toward her budget, watching her savings grow bit by bit. There were setbacks, of course. Sarah wasn't perfect. One weekend, she splurged on an expensive dinner with friends, feeling the guilt settle in almost immediately afterward. But instead of letting it derail her progress, she acknowledged the mistake and moved forward, adjusting her budget for the next month to account for the slip-up. Her victories, no matter how small, were starting to add up, and with each one, Sarah's confidence grew. She was building something lasting, new habits that would carry her toward financial freedom. This wasn't just about cutting back. It was about creating a future she could be proud of. Sarah stood at the checkout counter, clutching the sleek new handbag she hadn't planned on buying. It was beautiful, soft leather, the perfect shade of red, a brand she had admired for years. She had walked into the store just to browse, to kill some time before meeting a friend for coffee, but here she was, wallet in hand, ready to swipe her credit card. The sales associate smiled at her, scanning the tag. "You made a great choice," she said, as if that tiny bit of validation would justify Sarah's impulsive decision, and for a brief moment, it did. Sarah's heart raced as she handed over her card. The familiar excitement of buying something new washed over her, drowning out the voice in her head reminding her of her budget, her goals, her progress. In the back of her mind, she knew this wasn't a smart choice, but just this once, she told herself, it would be okay. As soon as the transaction went through, though, the excitement faded. She left the store with the handbag tucked under her arm, but all she felt was regret. It was the same feeling she had promised herself she'd avoid, the sinking realization that she had undone some of the progress she had worked so hard to achieve. By the time she got home, the regret had turned into guilt, and Sarah tossed the handbag onto her bed, staring at it as if it might somehow undo itself. "Why did I do that?" she whispered, feeling the familiar weight settle back into her chest. She had been so good for weeks, sticking to her budget, resisting temptation, making sacrifices to get closer to her goals. But now, with one swipe of her card, she felt like she had thrown it all away. She spent the rest of the day in a fog, her mind replaying the moment at the checkout counter over and over again. The handbag sat on her dresser, a glaring reminder of her mistake. She couldn't return it. The boutique had a strict no-refund policy on sale items, but she could feel the guilt growing with every glance at it. That night, lying in bed, Sarah scrolled through her budget spreadsheet, her heart sinking as she adjusted the numbers to account for the unplanned purchase. It wasn't catastrophic. She could still pay her bills, still make progress on her credit card payments, but it was a setback, and it stung. For a while, she let herself wallow in the guilt. "I ruined everything," she thought. "Why can't I stick to my goals?" But then, something shifted. Sarah realized that this wasn't the end of her journey. She hadn't ruined everything. She had just hit a bump in the road, and that was okay. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a new perspective. Instead of beating herself up over the handbag, she decided to learn from the experience. She knew that financial discipline wasn't going to be perfect, and that setbacks were part of the process. What mattered wasn't the mistake, but how she responded to it. She sat down at her kitchen table, sipping her coffee as she revised her budget. She adjusted her spending plan for the month, cutting back in other areas to make up for the splurge. It wasn't ideal, but it was manageable. And more importantly, it was a reminder that she had the power to get back on track, no matter how far she strayed. As the days went on, Sarah began to feel less guilty about the handbag. Instead, she saw it as a lesson in self-compassion. She wasn't perfect, and that was okay. Financial growth wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about learning from them and moving forward with a renewed sense of purpose. When she met up with her friend Rachel the following week, Rachel complimented her on the new handbag, but instead of feeling a pang of guilt, Sarah smiled. "Thanks," she said. "It's a long story, but I've learned a lot from buying it." And she had. Sarah knew there would be more temptations, more moments when she'd feel like giving in to old habits. But now she understood that setbacks didn't define her progress. They were simply part of the journey. With each challenge, she was becoming stronger, more aware of her spending triggers, and more committed to her financial boundaries. The path wasn't always straight, but Sarah was learning to embrace the twists and turns, knowing that every setback was just another step toward her ultimate goal. Months had passed since Sarah bought the handbag, and something inside her had shifted. The old impulses that once drove her to spend without thinking had begun to quiet down. Now, when she opened her wallet, it wasn't driven by the need to maintain an image. It was about making choices that aligned with her long-term goals. Sitting at her kitchen table, Sarah clicked through her banking app, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. For the first time in years, her savings account had a number that made her feel proud, not anxious. Her debt, once towering over her like an insurmountable obstacle, had shrunk noticeably. She was making progress, not just in paying off what she owed, but in regaining control over her life. She checked off the last of her monthly bills and closed her laptop, satisfied with the balance she had achieved. It wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. And for the first time, she could see that progress reflected in her bank accounts. The numbers, once a source of fear and avoidance, were now proof that her efforts were paying off. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "Drinks tonight? Let's catch up." In the past, Sarah might have felt pressured to suggest an expensive bar or restaurant to live up to the lifestyle her friends expected, but things were different now. She texted back, "How about we grab coffee instead? I'm trying to keep things simple." To her relief, Lisa responded quickly, "Sounds perfect. See you at 7. Sarah felt a sense of pride, not just in the decision to opt for a more budget-friendly evening, but in how natural it felt. Saying no to unnecessary spending had once been a struggle, but now it was simply part of her life. She had broken the cycle of overextending herself for the sake of appearances, and in its place, she had built something far more valuable: self-discipline and peace of mind. Later that evening, as she sipped her coffee with Lisa, she found herself reflecting on how much had changed. "You seem different," Lisa said, stirring her drink thoughtfully. "Calmer, maybe. Happier." Sarah smiled, nodding slowly. "I feel different," she admitted. "I've been working on getting my finances under control, and I didn't realize how much it would affect everything else in my life." It was true. The more Sarah had focused on building financial boundaries and sticking to her budget, the more other aspects of her life had come into focus. She had stopped worrying about what people thought of her, stopped chasing the latest trend or the newest luxury item. Instead, she was focused on creating a life that felt sustainable, a life that didn't leave her stressed and exhausted at the end of each month. Her confidence grew with every debt payment, with every small deposit into her savings. She no longer felt like she was barely treading water. Instead, she was swimming steadily toward a future she could actually look forward to. At home that night, Sarah sat down with her notebook and reviewed her progress. Her credit card balances had shrunk significantly, and while there was still work to be done, she felt in control, something she hadn't experienced in years. Her savings, though modest, had become a source of pride. Each dollar represented a step toward her goals, a little bit of security that she was building for herself. The biggest change, though, was in her mindset. The constant need to impress others, to maintain a facade of success, had faded. She no longer cared about keeping up with her friends' spending habits or living a life she couldn't afford. What mattered now was her own peace of mind, her own sense of security. Sarah had learned that true success wasn't about what she wore or where she vacationed. It was about living in a way that aligned with her values. And her values, she realized, had shifted dramatically. It wasn't about luxury anymore. It was about control, freedom, and the confidence that came from knowing she was on the right path. She still had a long way to go, but that no longer scared her. She was proud of the progress she had made, and even more, she was proud of the person she was becoming, a woman who had learned the power of financial boundaries and the freedom they brought. As she closed her notebook, she felt a calm she hadn't known before, a sense of control that felt steady and true. Sarah wasn't just surviving anymore, She was thriving, and she knew that the best was yet to come. Sarah sat by her window, a cup of tea warming her hands, and stared out at the quiet street below. The past year had been transformative, in more ways than she ever imagined. As the sunlight streamed in, she felt a deep sense of peace, something she hadn't experienced in what felt like a lifetime. It wasn't just the absence of debt or the growing balance in her savings account. It was the sense of control she had over her life, her decisions, and her future. She thought back to the person she was when this journey began, the woman who measured her worth in handbags and high-end dinners, who had masked her insecurity with luxury, all while drowning in debt she couldn't face. That version of herself felt like a stranger now. Sarah could see so clearly how lost she had been, how desperately she had clung to the illusion of success, even as her financial world crumbled around her. Now, the concept of financial boundaries wasn't just a tool she used. It had become a part of who she was. Setting those limits had given her something she had never expected: freedom. It was ironic, really. For so long, she had resisted the idea of budgeting and cutting back, afraid it would make her life smaller, more restricted. But what she discovered was the opposite. Those boundaries had made room for a kind of freedom she had never known. Her days no longer revolved around the anxiety of looming bills or the compulsion to buy something new to fill an emotional void. Instead, Sarah found joy in the simple things: taking long walks, reading a book, spending time with friends without the pressure to keep up appearances. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. Her financial stability was proof enough to herself. Looking around her home, Sarah smiled at how different things were. The clutter of impulse purchases was gone, replaced by a calm, intentional space. Each piece she owned had been chosen carefully, not out of some fleeting desire, but because it truly added value to her life. She had learned to love the process of saving, of watching her money grow, knowing that it wasn't about depriving herself. It was about creating a future that was sustainable and secure. Every month, she set aside a portion of her income for her savings and future investments. And while the numbers grew slowly, they grew steadily. And that steady growth gave her a sense of empowerment that no designer handbag ever could. Sarah often found herself reflecting on how far she had come. When she thought about her old spending habits, there was no longer guilt or regret, just a sense of clarity. Those habits were a part of her past, a reminder of how easy it was to fall into the trap of overspending when you're trying to fill an emotional void. But now she could look back at that version of herself with compassion, not judgment. She had been doing the best she could with what she knew at the time. The best part of this new life, though, wasn't just the financial security. It was the emotional peace that came with it. Sarah no longer woke up in the middle of the night with her heart racing, no longer avoided looking at her bank statements out of fear. Instead, she felt calm, in control, and confident in her decisions. Her finances were no longer a source of stress. They were a source of pride. There were still moments, of course, when temptation would arise, an ad for the latest fashion trend, a sale on something she didn't really need. But those moments no longer had power over her. Sarah had learned to pause, to reflect on whether the purchase aligned with her financial goals, and more often than not, she chose to pass. It wasn't a struggle anymore. It was simply a choice, one that brought her closer to the life she wanted to lead. As she sipped her tea and looked out at the world, Sarah knew that the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always new goals to set and new boundaries to create. But she wasn't afraid of them. She had built a foundation of self-discipline and empowerment, one that would carry her through whatever came next. And as she reflected on the journey from chaos to control, she couldn't help but feel proud of the person she had become, and proud of the life she was continuing to build, one boundary at a time. Sarah sat in her living room, reflecting on the long journey she had taken to regain control of her finances. It hadn't been easy. There were moments when she doubted herself, times when she slipped up, and setbacks that made her question if she would ever truly be free from the weight of her debt. But she had made it through, stronger and wiser for the experience. Now she wanted to share her story with others who might be going through the same struggles. If there was one thing she had learned, it was that no matter how deep you're buried in debt or how out of control your spending may feel, there is always a way out. You just need to take that first step, and the rest will follow. If you're reading this and feel overwhelmed by your finances, I want you to know that I've been there, Sarah would say to anyone in a similar situation. I know what it feels like to wake up every day with a pit in your stomach, to avoid looking at your bank account because you're too afraid of what you'll see. I know how easy it is to swipe that card, to convince yourself that you deserve that treat, that one more purchase won't hurt. But trust me, there's a way out, and it starts with setting boundaries. Financial boundaries were the turning point for Sarah. She learned that these boundaries weren't restrictions, but tools that helped her regain control. The hardest part for me was realizing that a budget isn't about deprivation, she would explain. It's about creating a structure that allows you to live comfortably within your means. You don't have to give up everything. You just need to prioritize what truly matters. Sarah had once believed that self-discipline meant denying herself all the pleasures she had grown accustomed to. But over time, she came to understand that discipline wasn't about saying no to everything. It was about learning when to say yes and when to say no. The truth is, when you start making conscious financial decisions, you'll find that it's not nearly as painful as you imagined. In fact, it's empowering, she would share with others. There had been times when Sarah felt like she'd never escape the cycle of overspending, like she was too far gone to change. But looking back, she realized that financial discipline, like any other habit, is a process. You won't get it right every time, and that's okay, she would remind anyone feeling disheartened. I made plenty of mistakes along the way, but each one taught me something valuable. The important thing is to keep moving forward. Sarah knew that the emotional aspect of debt could be just as challenging as the financial one. Debt can make you feel ashamed, isolated, even hopeless, she'd say. But you don't have to carry that burden alone. Talk to someone, whether it's a financial advisor or a trusted friend, and start making a plan. The sooner you face it, the sooner you can take control. She would emphasize the importance of small victories because those were what kept her going. Every time you make a payment toward your debt or choose to save instead of spend, celebrate it, she'd encourage. Those small moments of discipline add up over time, and eventually you'll see real progress. It's not about perfection, it's about persistence. For Sarah, the most profound lesson had been learning that financial freedom wasn't about having more money. It was about having control over the money she had. When you set boundaries and stick to them, you'll find that your money goes further, she'd share with a knowing smile. You'll start to realize that true wealth isn't about what you own. It's about the peace of mind that comes from knowing you're in control of your finances. Her final piece of advice would be simple. Take it one step at a time. Don't try to overhaul your entire life overnight. Start small, set one boundary, make one change, and build from there. It's not going to be easy, but I promise, it will be worth it. As Sarah looked back on her journey, she felt proud of how far she had come. She had gone from financial chaos to control, from living for the moment to planning for the future. And the best part was knowing that she could help others do the same. If I can do it, so can you, she'd say with confidence. And when you start to see the progress, when you begin to feel that sense of control over your life, you'll know that you're on the right path. In the end, Sarah had found something far more valuable than any luxury item, a sense of empowerment and freedom that came from financial discipline, and she was ready to share that gift with anyone willing to take the first step toward a better future.